in Canada. So yeah, I'll just get started and present to you some of the research that I've been conducting in the Southwest Western Australian biodiversity hotspot. All right, so I got my doctorate about 2 years ago. I spent 4 years researching native bees in urban areas and how the introduced European honeybee impacts our native bees. That's my Twitter and Insta if anyone wants to learn more about my research. To start off with, let's set the scene, start at the very basics. What are bees? So bees are special because they rely exclusively on a diet of nectar and pollen throughout their whole entire life cycle. And this makes them usually quite effective pollinators. Not always, especially in Australia, we've actually got lots of bees that diverge from your typical sort of idea of what a bee looks like, which is, usually a honeybee or a fuzzy bumblebee, which sadly we don't have here except as an introduced species in Tasmania. Now, other insects often get mistaken for bees, especially wasps and flies. They visit flowers as well for nectar, but the larvae have a different diet. So with wasps, it's usually carnivorous, so they'll prey on your garden pests. So really important role for wasps. They can also be parasitoids or hyperparasitoids. So they lay their eggs in the bodies of other insects, and then the babies hatch out and eat the insects from the inside. And then with flies, the larvae, which are called maggots, eat decaying things. There's also morphological features. So flies can easily be distinguished because they've just got one pair of wings. Bees and wasps have two. Their antennae are another giveaway. Flies have short, straight antennae. Bees have longer antennae. Bees and wasps look very similar with their antennal features, but wasps tend to have it lower down on their forehead. Their eye shape, flies have big bulgy eyes. Bees and wasps have oval eyes, but they tend to be a bit more kidney shaped. And then hairiness, the scientific word is pilosity. So bees typically are hairier, but not always. So in Australia, we've got Hylaeans and Euroglossines, and the Euroglossinae is a subfamily of about 800 species that only occur in Australia. So the cool thing about Australia is that because we're isolated from the rest of the world and we've been isolated for hundreds of thousands of years, our fauna is involved in isolation. So we have these rare, unique species that are found nowhere else in the world that develop really cool adaptations. In examples for the sort of vertebrates that everyone focuses on are things like marsupials, but the same happens with other fauna and flora. So we also have bees and wasps that are hairy as well. We've got golid wasps that are quite hairy and bombillid flies that are hairy as well. But at the top, we've got a bee there. That's a megachili bee. In the middle is Rhynchium superbum. It's probably pronounced superbum, but it does have a pretty super bum. So that's how I pronounce it. I did some research on this bee wasp because it was using my bee hotels. And this species is actually from Eastern Australia. And as I mentioned, Australia is a very big place, so it's essentially been introduced to another part of the world. And then down the bottom are the syrphid flies. So bees evolved 125 million years ago. This is back during the time of the non-avian dinosaurs. And interestingly, they evolved not long after angiosperms evolved, flowering plants. And when they evolved, angiosperms were just a small part of the flora, but then they diversified and radiated out to be the most prolific and successful flower group today. And part of this is with the co-evolution of flower visiting insects, of which bees are now, for most plants, the most important ones. Flowers want the bees to visit them, so they entice them with nectar and pollen. And they advertise these rewards with colour and scent. And bees have amazing senses of smell and amazing senses of vision, and they can see into the UV spectrum. So many flowers have UV reflective colours that us mammals can't see. They actually can't really see red, but it doesn't mean that they won't visit red flowers. So my research has found some of the favourite flowers here in Western Australia includes these red callistemon, which are called bottle brushes. And Southwest Western Australia actually has a remarkable amount of flowers that are pollinated by vertebrates, especially birds and even mammals. They've got a little marsupial called the honey possum, and it's very small. It's only about as big as my hand, and it only eats nectar and pollen. So mammals and birds have really good ability to see with red. Even though bees can't see red, there's probably other cues such as I mentioned, UV reflectance or smell. When the bees go to get their reward of nectar and pollen, they brush against the anthers, which is the male part of the flower. Pollen gets deposited on their bodies, and then when they go to another flower, they achieve cross-pollination for that flower. And this is a mutual relationship, so both partners benefit. We have male and female bees. Male bees are produced from unfertilized eggs. Females are produced from fertilized eggs, and this is the same with all Hymenoptera, so ants and wasps and sawflies. Male bees don't have a sting, so you can't be stung by a male bee. Soon I'll be talking to you about some female bees that also don't have a sting that occur in Australia. Male bees have slightly longer antennae, and this is because the antennae are used to smell, so they want to be able to smell the sexy scents of the females, and they tend to be smaller. So at the top there, that's a Megachile Utritria chrysopyga male, and down the bottom is the female. Okay, oops. Skip the most important one. Okay, so we have about 2,000 species of native bees in Australia. About 800 are in Western Australia, where I live. Many of them are endemic, meaning they aren't found anywhere else in the world. Australia is a mega diverse country with fauna that don't occur anywhere else. It's a very special place in terms of the biodiversity landscape of the world. And it's recognized as one of the 5 mega diverse countries. So a very, very important place for biodiversity, nature, flowers, natural landscapes. We don't have 2 families, Andrenidae and Mellididae, but we do have a family of bees, the Stenotrididae, which only occurs in Australia. So a whole entire family of bees have evolved in Australia. So some examples of the bees in these families are at the top left is Amygilla. This is a genus of bees that are really popular among the public because they're quite big and they do buzz pollination. Then to the right, that's Megachile orifrons. The Megachile are also important pollinators because they have scopae, which are the pollen collecting hairs on the underside of their abdomen, so not on their legs, which makes them really good pollinators because it's brushing up against the anthers almost every time. And they're the main ones that use the bee hotels. In the middle is Lipotrichis australica, and that's a halictid. Halictids are a very common family that occur across most parts of the world. Down the bottom there is a colletid. Now, Australia is special in that most of our bee species are collettids, and this is quite unusual because in other parts of the world, they don't even have collettids, or they're only a minor component. That there is Hylaeus ruficeps calamundae, and that species I discovered was nesting in polystyrene. Any of my papers, if you want to read them, just send me an email and I'll send them to you. And then that bee down the bottom there, the beautiful metallic green one, that is Stenocoletes smaragdinus. And that one is one of those very rare stenotridid bees. So an amazing array of colors, shapes, and sizes of bees that don't occur anywhere else in the world. Sadly, no bumblebees, but we have bees that are similar to bumblebees, the Xylocopa, and they are massive, big, fuzzy bees, and they occur up north and along the eastern Queensland, but not in Western Australia. So that bee down the bottom there, the big, fuzzy golden one, that is Xylocopa, one of the Xylocopa species. And as you can see, he's nice and big and fuzzy. So most of our native bees are solitary. They don't live in colonies and they don't care for their offspring either. We have degrees of sociality though. It's not sort of a black and white social versus non-social. We've got semi-social exonura, and then the halictids are also semi-social in that they can share, say, a nesting burrow, but each female has her own particular nest. We do have some eusocial bees. So eusociality is sort of like the epitome and pinnacle of sociality, where you've got a single reproductive female and the other females have forgone their ability to reproduce in order to help their mother and their sisters and the colony. We have many tiny, tiny bees in Australia. So the Euroglossines, the subfamily that only occurs here, most of them are less than a centimetre long, and we have some of the smallest bees in the whole entire world. Some are just over 2 millimeters long, so really, really tiny. And despite this tiny size and tiny brains. They can still do all the same things that the large bees do: forage for flowers, navigate, something that I can't even do with a GPS. Um, and we've got some big bees though, and that includes the Xylocopa and one of my favorite species, Amygdala dawsoni. And these are about 2.5 to just under 3 centimeters long, so very big bees. And as I mentioned before, we've got bees that don't even have hairs because they swallow the pollen and then regurgitate it back up the nest. All right, so how can we help our bees? Well, they need flowers for food. And as I mentioned, Australia is a very special place, having evolved in isolation. So many bees and flowers have really specialized co-evolutionary relationships. And so if you just put in your typical standard garden plants that are popular across the world, many of our native bees won't even forage on them. So it's really important to plant local plants. And this is actually sort of the same across the world, but particularly important in Australia due to these special co-evolutionary relationships. So these are some of our flowers. The Myrtaceae, the gum trees, they're sort of iconic of Australia. And they are really incredible because they have mass flowering blossoms and they produce so much nectar and pollen and attract such a diversity of species. I've gone to places where I can collect from just a single tree about 200 bees representing 50 species. So they are key resources. We also have native pea plants that our bees specialize, such as this Trichocoletes. Then we've got some native daisies. As you can see, they look a little bit different to your standard daisy. Then there's general bees that will forage on other resources. We can help our bees out as well with bee hotels. So these are artificial nesting structures. I've got research that I've been conducting that sadly I ran out of funding to publish it, but I was looking at bee hotel use in urban areas, what designs work, what don't, and a really interesting part of my research that again I ran out of funding to, but looking at how the pollen collected in the bee nests overlapped with pollen from honeybee colonies, and how this overlapped and the honeybee abundance at these sites impacted the native bee reproductive success, which is the key metric to know if honeybees are impacting native bees. So hopefully I'll be able to get that out there one day. We also have ground nesting bees. So helping them out basically just means leaving patches bare ground. We also need to be careful with what we spray. This is not quite a black and white issue, because sometimes targeted pesticides mean we can clear less land, which means more land can be used for bee conservation. And then the use of herbicides, again, they're not black and white. If we use them to eliminate flowering resources, we might be destroying native bee food. But if we're using herbicides to eliminate invasive plant species so that native plant species can be restored, then they have a place. Oops. Sorry, I don't know why. Oh, here we go. So one of the leading causes of native bee endangerment is habitat loss and climate change. And both of these, a major contributor is livestock agriculture. And this is probably the worst kind of agriculture for bees, because grasses don't provide native bees with foraging resources. Livestock contributes a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And I just had a chapter that is about to be published in a book where I reviewed the research on climate change and its impact on bees across the world. So stay tuned, because that will be coming out very soon. But in brief, climate change disrupts the synchronicity between the flowers and the bees. And, you know, many bees and flowers are only available for a short period of time throughout the year. So if there's a mismatch, then the bees won't get their food. Places getting hotter, bees will need to migrate, or they might go extinct, and same with their host plants. We're having extreme weather in Australia. This is mainly in the form of droughts and bushfires. And I just finished a project on bushfires and the impact on native bees using bee hotels to monitor this. And it can also alter the nectar and pollen chemistry. These are massive threats. They are the main threats, as I mentioned. But the good thing is that we can do something about it just by reducing the amount of meat or eliminating meat in our diet. We can massively cut our carbon footprint. So my thesis was called Urban Native Bee Assemblages and the Impact of the Introduced European Honeybee on Plant Pollinator Networks in Southwest Australian Biodiversity Hotspot. A big mouthful, but basically it was about we need to conserve bees, pollinators are declining. A lot of research has been conducted in agricultural landscapes, but urban landscapes are the most rapidly expanding form of human land use. How can we manage our cities better so that we can conserve our bees? There's also a big boom in honeybees, their popularity and people keeping them in backyards. How is this introduced species impacting our native bees? So I reviewed the literature, I reviewed how we should even monitor bees and did some empirical tests on the best way to monitor bees. I looked at the value of remnant vegetation versus people's gardens, plant pollinator networks, and honeybee competition. So this review is now published. So ignore the under review, it is now published. A global review of the determinants of native bee assemblages in urban landscapes. Urban landscapes are novel landscapes, but they're really important for bee conservation because we actually have a lot more power to design our cities with bees in mind. There's no conflict between producing yield to feed, a growing human population. We can specifically design our gardens, our verges, our parks so that native bees can thrive in these areas. And many of these areas actually are really biodiverse for native bees. So we have a lot to lose, but a lot of opportunities. So there's a lot in that review. I'll let you get stuck into it. Then I published a paper called The Relative Performance of Sampling Methods for Native Bees. There's many methods to survey the native bees. Not are created equally, as I found. Pan traps are really popular and common because they're quite easy. You just put pans out, hypothetically bees go into them and you can survey their community. But it's actually not the case. Firstly, they're not as effective as going out with a sweep net, also not as fun, but they collect a very biased subset of the bee fauna. They also work better in poor landscapes. So this can seriously bias your estimates of bee abundance and diversity and the impact of land use change on native bee assemblages. So from this, I was continually reading papers by people published in Australia that were using really inappropriate methods and drawing some very wrong and concerning conclusions, such as dairy farms are better for bees than forest, or not even considering the taxonomy of native bees and lumping all black bees together. So you're getting a very biased estimate of the diversity of bees. So we published this forum, basically drawing attention to the need to be more critical, both of how we design studies, how we can conduct studies, and how we review studies. Really drawing attention to focusing on accurate, reliable methods and using proper taxonomy so that the native bee diversity is, put at the forefront. And that paper is published in Austral Ecology, and we provide some solutions to this problem as well. So then to my empirical research, I compared native vegetation remnants with residential gardens, because there could be this idea that if we clear vegetation and we put in gardens, things will be all right for bees. We're putting in green space, we're putting in flowers. It's basically equivalent, right? Well, it's not. You can't replace thriving native vegetation ecosystems with a garden. And this has negative impacts on both native bee abundance and diversity, but not honeybees because they're quite generalist, so they adapt well. But that's not what we want. We want to focus on conserving a biodiversity of native bees. I found that the most important thing we can do is plant high proportions of native flowers in our gardens and reduce the amount of built space around our gardens. So connect up gardens with verges, with the remnant bushland, so that we have basically a green corridor throughout our cities. I also looked at the structure of pollination networks between these two habitat types. And as you can see in residential gardens, it was dominated by the introduced European honeybee, whereas in the native bushland remnants, we had more native flora, which meant that there were more native bees. The community composition was very different. So again, emphasizing that these habitats aren't equivalent. In particular, the bushland remnants had a lot more specialized species.
Good.
And then I did a whole heap of sort of network analyses. All this is published in papers if you want to dig into the details a bit more. But the main takeaway is that the structural properties of these pollination networks all indicated that the bushland remnants were healthier habitats. So now onto the very controversial issue of honeybees, which get a lot of popularity in the media. There's this narrative going around that honeybees are endangered and they might go extinct, but this is actually a myth. In contrast, they actually might be causing the extinction and endangerment of our native bees. So how can they do this? Well, they both need nectar and pollen. And so if there's not enough foraging resources to go around, honeybees could outcompete the native bees. They could do this physically, but it doesn't tend to get into a brawl. It's more resource competition. So they're more abundant. They start foraging earlier, they finish foraging later. And so they take all the food so that there's not enough food left for the native bees, leading to population declines and potentially eventually extinction. And they can also alter pollinator networks because of the way that they forage. So I conducted research over 2 years and looked at how honeybees are impacting pollination networks and whether they're competing with native bees. So this is again published, and if you want to get into the details, I've got these 2 publications here. So they did impact pollination networks. The honeybees are in red, and you can see they absolutely dominated the networks. The native bees are in gold, and these are genera. So they're not even one species, they're genera of bees. And despite the native bees having, in some sites, 50 species, honeybees still dominated. And they were particularly dominant in the residential gardens. They also had very different roles from the native bees. So this is looking at basically their roles in the pollination networks. And you can see that honeybees stood out. They're not equivalent to native bees in their pollination abilities or how they visit flowers, how they interact with different plants. They're less specific, they're less reliant on the plants and vice versa. And they have a lot more variability in what plants they visit. They also impacted the whole entire network properties. So they made networks less connected. And this is a bad thing. So if you're thinking about something that's really connected, if there's a disruption in one of the nodes in the network, this will have minimal impact on the functioning of the entire network. But if networks are unstable, then if there's a disruption, the whole entire network can collapse. And this is what is suggested the honeybees might be capable of. They also increased the complementarity and niche overlap, which are signs of competition. And this occurred in both years, and they also made the networks more generalized. So they impact networks. Do they impact native bees? The answer is not so clear cut here. So when I just looked at broad metrics of abundance, I found no association. When I looked at how they impact species richness, I found that it varied by the year. Some years they were positively associated, other years they were negatively associated, which just showcases how variable ecology is. And it depends on all these factors, but you need to look a bit deeper into the details as well. So I first looked at how floral resources impact competition, because standard theory suggests that if there's more flowers, competition will be reduced. But I found the opposite. And at first I was like, I've probably done an error, I've entered my data wrong or something. But I reran the analyses, I checked all the data, and I found that these results did. And it's because in residential gardens, there's lots of flower species, but most of these flower species are exotic plants. Honeybees are generalists, they can thrive on exotic plants. Our native bees are specialists, they don't do so well. So if you put in lots of plants that favor honeybees, it's going to give them a competitive edge. Body size might also impact competition. So if bees are bigger, they need more floral resources, they might be most vulnerable to competition with honeybees. And indeed, that's exactly what I found. So whilst you look at a general metric of abundance, there's no association. But if you divvy it up in terms of body size, larger bees were negatively impacted by honeybee competition. Then I looked at how overlap impacts competition, because if species forage on different resources, there's not going to be any competition. But if they both have preferences for the same floral resources, then this sets up the potential for competition. And indeed, that's what I found. The bees that overlapped with honeybees in their floral preferences were negatively impacted. Those that foraged on different resources were okay. So not all taxa are equally vulnerable. The ones that are most vulnerable are our Hylaean bees. So those bees that are quite unique to Australia, they're vulnerable to competition. The Amygilla, they're generalists, they did okay, and they forage on these flowers that are buzz pollinated, flowers that honeybees can't collect pollen from. So they have a refuge from competition. The Hylaean bees, though, they don't have that option to switch floral resources. So they were particularly vulnerable. The habitat type, as I mentioned, influenced how intense competition was. So residential gardens, competition and resource overlap were greater. What can we do though? Well, we need to eradicate feral colonies. Feral honeybees have no place in the environment, sort of like feral cats. They are a domesticated species. They have a role in agriculture, but they're not part of our wider ecosystem. And we really need to reduce the density of backyard beekeepers, because professional beekeepers we need for pollination services. Hobbyist backyard beekeepers, they're not contributing to, our honey or crop pollination. It's also concerning because they don't tend to do any certification courses or register their hives. So swarm prevention is something really important. But what we really need to do is plant more native plants and preserve native vegetation so that there's enough floral resources and honeybees don't have that competitive edge that we saw in residential gardens. So I've also done some other research, including looking at pollinators in Tasmania, which is where we have the bumblebees, which are introduced, but they're still really cute. Research on how we can, this one's more philosophical, I guess, but how we can have lifestyles that are more sustainable for biodiversity, and a lot of cool natural history observations that you never get funding for, you never plan for, but when you're doing research with bees, there's all these things that you discover that you never knew, you could never, hypothesize about. So this particular one, with my bee hotels, I was seeing a lot of fuzz in the nest, and I was like, this is a little weird. Why are they putting Banksia fuzz in? This isn't floral resources. And I found that it occurred in the nest, every single nest of this species, Megachile ignita. And this is the only bee in the world to do this. So that was pretty cool. I also did some research on fires, which are becoming increasingly prevalent under climate change. In 2019, 2020, a lot of Australia burnt, and we have no on-the-ground monitoring. So what we did instead was we did this complex modelling where we looked at bee distributions and analysed them in relation to the distribution of the fire and how they might be impacted based on their life history traits. For example, whether they nest in cavities or on the ground, their body size. So that paper is available, and I just finished a project looking at not so much how bees were impacted by the fires, but how we might be able to do something practical to recover them after the fires. So putting in bee hotels, and this was actually quite successful. So I had lots and lots of bee hotels installed across fire sites. 500 bee hotels installed in total. Every single site had the bee hotels occupied. So there is something that we can do in a practical sense to help bees recover after these devastating natural history disasters that probably going to, be part of our landscape as climate change increases in intensity. In addition to the sort of hardcore science, I also strongly believe in educating people about native bees because they're a bit on the fringe. And so I had this opportunity to bring them to the forefront of public consciousness at Fringe World Festival. I dressed up as a bee and I had a photographic display, and there's this garden called the Pleasure Garden, and I took kids on tours around the garden, talking to them about bees and doing like little bee headbanging dances, and also educating the mums and dads as well. So that was really rewarding, and yeah, it's a very unique way of getting people to learn about native bees. I was also in FameLab, and as I said, no fortune there, but it was semi-fame, and I got to compete with people across Australia. It was friendly competition, not honeybee competition, but friendly competition with people across Australia, where I had to summarize my research in 2.5 minutes. And that is a very difficult thing to do. So you have to strip it down to the very bare bones. But it was a really fun experience. And we had a presenter from the BBC come over and coach us, Dallas Campbell. So a really rewarding experience. And Professor Alan Duffy was our MC, and he's a bit of like a science celebrity. So that was really cool meeting him. I've also done a bit of like alternative ways to get bees out in the public consciousness, including being a liquor baron's legit local and promoting bees through that. So all these sort of alternative avenues to, I guess, inform people about bees who probably wouldn't think about bees very much. One of my favorite bits of research, though, was studying Amygdala dorsoni, and I have a very cool little video clip for you here. Them contributing to their population. And I study the mating habits of the native bees, and their sounds that they make. That sound in the background is a motorbike, because weirdly enough, these native bees that are very special, they nest in clay pans, including on a rifle range, which is a bit scary, going to Carnarvon and staying on a rifle range studying these bees. But it was a really cool experience, and we got to record their mating behavior with a scientist from Arizona. Now, if you want to learn anything more about our native bees, I have a Facebook group called Bees in the Burbs, and people can post photos there so you can see all the amazing diversity of native bees across Australia, but anyone in the world is welcome. We've got people from Canada, from South America, from Indonesia, and I'll be sharing any of my research as well as the latest in bee research. I also have a book about native bees, if you're interested in it. It's in particular about bee hotels, which are getting a lot of popularity and traction. However, this is a double-edged sword, because some of the bee hotels that are being sold are not designed by bee scientists or with bees in mind, it appears. They're more of a thing for show, and they can actually have negative impacts on native bees if they're designed poorly. So it's really important to design them well. As I mentioned with my fire research, if they're designed well, they can do wonders for native bees, but if they're designed poorly, you can actually harm the native bees. I also have a little guide on Australian bee taxonomy, so you can learn about all the diversity of our native bees, what they look like, the different genera, and also a book on Amygdala dorsoni, which is a very popular bee, a very cool bee, even according to Sir David Attenborough, who came all the way to Australia just to film them. I also have some designs that I've been doing. So also, I'm a scientist. I absolutely adore the arts, and I think like science and arts make the most beautiful marriage, and each complement each other. So using art to showcase native bees, I think is a real way to get people to actually care. You can flood them with information and scientific papers, but to get people really engaged and connected with bees, I think we really need art. So I've done some artwork and some sort of alternative ways. Oh, you can get bee masks, because masks are so popular and trendy at the moment. So that's also available. And if you want to see some like diversity of native bees in each of the regions of Australia, as I mentioned, Australia is, I keep saying this, but it's a really incredible place with bees that are found nowhere else. We have blue bees, we have kleptoparasitic bees, we have golden bees, we have bees that dig nest 3 meters deep. So all these weird and wacky lifestyles, and you can see some of the native bees there. So if you're interested in any of my research, most of it's available through my ORCID or my ResearchGate. If you can't access it, then send me an email. I've got a paper out just recently on the representation of bees in art and culture, which is available open access, and I'm working on a follow-up paper looking at like dynamic bee art, so tattoos, performing arts, and my research on the bees regarding fires, I'm going to be writing that up too. So there's a lot in the works and a lot to still be done. And I can provide bee photos if you're ever interested in sort of having some native bee photos in any pamphlets or leaflets about native bee conservation. So that is all from me of Bees of Australia. I hope you now want to come to Australia and see our amazing bees. And that's the thing, they're everywhere. Like, you can just go into your garden or your local park. You don't need to go hours away into some wilderness to find native bees. Or wildlife in general. Australia just has wildlife everywhere. So it's a really amazing place. Same with our flowers. They're everywhere along roadsides. So it's, yeah, a really cool place, and I recommend visiting it. And it's very warm as well. So I'm sure you guys there who are like freezing with snow outside will enjoy our beautiful warm weather. So thanks everyone. And yeah, if you have any further questions, just send me an email.
Thanks, Kit. I think we're going to open it up to questions. And so people who've got questions, please pipe up. And if I don't hear any questions shortly, I'll make up some of my own because I always have questions. But your turn first. Going once.
I have a question. I was wondering, you mentioned cattle grazing. What has been the effect of the Australian wine industry on the native bees?
So that has never been explored. And I actually sent out about a month ago, probably 20 emails to wineries being like, hey, I could look at how you can make your wineries more sustainable. And none of them got back to me. So I'm very disappointed about that. But it's something I think that should definitely be explored, because wineries, you know, they have like, you know, spaces between the rows where you can plant wildflowers, and they aren't, you know, they can definitely be conducive, I think, to bee conservation. It'd be something that I think definitely needs to be studied, and wineries, they should have the funding to fund that sort of research, and, you know, have maybe an eco-friendly label, because obviously like wines, they're all going for the sort of organic, non-GMO, eco-friendly sort of vibe lately, but it's something that really needs to be explored.
Thank you.
Good. We have Ingrid.
Yeah, I heard you say, Dr. Kit, that there are bad bee hotels and good bee hotels. Can you explain further about that?
Yes, so I mean, there's a lot of explanations in my book, but in short, the bee hotels that have holes that are too big won't be used by native bees. If the nesting holes are too short, then this leaves them open to parasite attacks and skewed sex ratios. If the bee hotels are too big, then it's basically a smorgasbord for predators and parasites and disease. So that's some of the issues with bee hotels. Also, if they're made from treated wood, for example, this could put toxic chemicals into the developing bee nests.
And I'll add into that, a lot of the pictures that you showed, Kit, you showed the cardboard tubes inside of the holes. Do you want to explain why that is?
So that, for me, that was so I could research them. I could take out the nests, x-ray them, and see how many native bee cells there were, how many babies were developing, any parasites, and look at bee body size, what species emerge. But that was my stuff. As I said, unfortunately, I ran out of funding to like write that all up. But it's also it's a good recommendation to use these cardboard tubes, because it means that once the bees have nested and emerged, you can replace the tubes. Otherwise, if you know, you sort of, the bees keep using them, debris builds up, fungus, leaves it open to disease. So replacing the tubes is actually a really good idea.
Yeah, Scott McIver here used bee hotels with the tubes, and feels strongly that replacing them every year is really important for bee health.
Yeah, I've read his papers. He's a great researcher.
I believe, Sarah, you had your hand up. Sarah, are you there? Sarah Yelland. And while we wait for Sarah to unmute herself, I'll ask, in talking about native bee versus honeybees, you recommended thinning out home beekeepers. What's the response to that when you go public with that in Australia?
Yeah, it is not met particularly well. Beekeepers feel very strongly that they are the stewards of the environment. And, you know, it's not just their fault, it's the media, it's, you know, society creating this narrative that a very abundant, successful introduced species needs saving, and that this species also is saving the environment because they're pollinators. But it's just, yeah, it's quite bizarre because it's quite obvious that, you know, they're not a wild species. They're kept in colonies. They're, you know, essentially livestock, and this idea that they're good for the environment is not backed by much evidence. They are really important for crop pollination and honey, but people need to just be aware of you know, what honeybees can and can't do, and we should leave these important tasks of pollinating crops to people who rely on it for their livelihood, rather than just everyone putting bees in their backyard.
I have a question where I'd like to get Junaid, if you're still there and listening, to come on and talk with Kit. Junaid's in charge of some of the Project Swallowtail activities that involve getting lots of native plants into urban gardeners' hands.
Mhm.
And I wonder if we could compare that to what might be happening in Australia.
Yeah, you were saying at the kickoff, Kit, that you were envious in some ways of Project Swallowtail, but I'm curious to know, is that because there isn't as much engagement with the public about like native pollinators and sort of this habitat creation piece, or that you are one of the like few folks, you know, yelling out about native bees and native plants and sort of these specialized relationships, or, you know, political will, combination of those things? Or yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I'd say a combination. I mean, there's this organization, like there's organizations for bees, but they're not based on evidence. Like there's one that's like Plant 3 for bees, and it's providing people with seeds of 3 introduced species across the country, which is counterproductive. Like, sure, I know wanting to help, but they're probably making things worse. So we just don't have that, like, you know, coordinated evidence-based, you know, promotion of native pollinators, and it's still very much sort of grouping all pollinators together, thinking that they're all the same. You just plant flowers, doesn't really matter what flowers. Whereas my research showing it actually does matter what flowers you plant. Like, you know, for example, swallowtail, you really need to plant the right flowers, because otherwise they're not going to have any impact, or probably negative impacts, by outcompeting the plants that the swallowtails need. So yeah, we just don't have that evidence-based approach here.
And are there any, so in the Ontario context, at the very least, there's, you know, the city of Toronto has a program to help people get funds and grants to do plantings of like pollinator gardens. It's called Pollinatio. And, you know, similar small efforts are starting to pop up in like municipalities across Canada. And so is there any similar interest? Because like planting native plant gardens and pollinator gardens is like low hanging fruit politically, you know, like you just, come on, man, you just got to plant some things, people get bees, like what's the problem? But any
Exactly.
sense on that front?
So it varies so much by the particular local councils. So some local councils are all for it. They've had me do like surveys of exactly what bees are there, what plants are planted, then getting those plants from nurseries and providing them to homeowners. Other councils appeared to like they couldn't really care less, or they are about sort of like promoting plants and providing people with plants, but it's more like not necessarily plants that are visited by bees, so more with a focus on water-wise gardens as opposed to gardens that are designed to help pollinators. So it varies a lot by the council, and we don't have a sort of coordinated effort at present.
Oh yeah, I was hoping that Diane would be here. So Diane in the audience is actually from Australia. I don't know exactly where things sit. Big time native plantings and landscaping in southeast Queensland. You're northwest?
I'm Southwest Australia, but I will be going to Queensland. So yeah, that is very good to know.
Yeah. So as far as I know, and Diane, I'll ask you to speak if you're able to. But I remember speaking with Diane about a project, about like a native plant nursery project that was started on like a community level. And I'm wondering if something, get in touch. Oh, wait. Can you speak, Diane?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. There we go. Great.
I came quite late. I don't know how to undo my visual, but yeah, I think in Southeast Queensland around, I don't know about the big cities because I was in more urban, semi-urban. We have a really big native plant thing, and we had our own community activity. We had our own community nursery, and there are a number of other community-based local native plant nurseries, which also have big time interest and educational programs around bees, native bees, particularly. I don't think, I think you're right about the evidence-based stuff not being sort of widespread. It's starting, but and I think there's a really, in all of Australia, there's a really big emphasis on native plants, which has come about in the last, I'd say, 5 or 10 years. That's what I think, anyhow.
A massive shift in the last like 5 years I've seen from people just wanting the typical, I guess, like European plants to lots of people wanting the native plants. And it's actually at the sort of grassroots community levels, like not a top-down thing. It's people, wanting people that actually own the gardens or have community gardens. It's very much a community-based thing, rather than that's a good thing, but it's also, I think, a bad thing because it's hard for everyone to like coordinate their efforts, and it makes it very much down to the individual. Whereas I feel like, the government should be useful for something, and they could, really help all these members of the community to plant native gardens because, the community want it. Like that's something that I've been recognizing. People, once they know about native bees, they want to help native bees. They want to have native bees in their garden, and they just don't know where to go for resources.
Can I just say that I think there's a, it depends on the part of Australia you're in, but certainly the Southeast Queensland Council, the Township Council, is very much behind it, and they have policies in their planning things, and all of their garden edges, and planting local, not necessarily local, but certainly native trees in the sort of road spaces. It's big time in Southeast Queensland. I'm not so sure about South Australia though, so.
Well, that's great to know. That's awesome.
Yeah, another question I bring up for anybody to speak to. Here in Toronto, we've had to deal with a legacy of the government regulating what you can grow in your front yard. We have weeds bylaws and other things, and many of them were written back when only European flowers were viewed as any good. And so allowing your native plants to grow meant that you were cultivating weeds. And we don't need to go into the history of that. We're coming out of that, but there's been a long battle to do that. So for a while, it was illegal to plant native plants in your front yard if it was close to the road. Has anything like that ever happened in Australia?
There are, in some councils, quite strict laws in terms of, especially the trees, and some councils are like, no, you can't plant these amazing good bee trees because people might have asthma. And yeah, there definitely are regulations depending on the suburbs of what you can and can't do. So again, no sort of coordinated rules, but yeah, some councils are quite rigid, and also like some councils are very much for like planting only sort of exotic trees because maybe aesthetics or they're the right height. But yeah, there is those sort of issues as well. It doesn't sound like they're as strict here, but there are, you know, some councils that are a bit weird about what you can and can't do with your own front yard.
We had a really bad incident in our council area where in a place called Butterham, it's not a very large city, maybe the size of maybe Welland or something like that, Barrie. And people were planting fruit trees on their verge between the sidewalk and the road. And the council came in and, against everybody's opinions and whatever else, came in and just said no and cut it all down. And then it raised such a protest amongst people, you know, that was just, everybody was upset about it, and petitions and everything else. And so the council turned the council around, actually. And so they now allow that. There's not so much emphasis on putting native species, you know, on those areas, but certainly fruit trees and vegetables and things like that.
And just while we're here, and I thank Project Swallowtail for hosting this meeting, Junaid, do you want to just tell us briefly what's happening this spring with Project Swallowtail?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know to what degree you know Project Swallowtail, Kit, but it was a creation of Clement and another one of our steering committee members, Pete Ewans's napkin writing talks while trying to discover how to engage people and then habitat creation. And the timing worked out so well because we kicked off right as the pandemic did. So we had to pivot all of the initially planned, you know, in-person activities, and we're going to do garden tours and walk around and learn about bees together, and all of that became virtual. So this spring, we're returning slowly to the sort of in-person model of being able to do things. And so one of the most successful things we were able to do last year was make native plants available to folks in Toronto and the GTA at very subsidized prices. And we essentially got in touch with native plant nurseries that are outside of the city and brought plants into the downtown core and curated them so that they were essentially like kits, pre-made kits of plants for dry shade or sunny conditions. And we're going to be doing that again this year. We've got a program called Seed Sitters that's currently running, where we're taking folks through the process of growing native plants from seeds themselves. And now this is an interesting thing that's popped up in my head, is that, you know, so native plants here require a period of cold, moist stratification or dormancy of some sort. I imagine the similar thing is not so much a problem in the place where you have to wear a hoodie when it's 20 degrees.
I think so.
Okay.
Some plants though require like fire to then germinate.
Okay, yeah.
Water, so yeah.
Okay,
different.
cool. We don't have any of those that I
We
am
do,
aware
Janae.
of.
We do.
That I'm growing? That we're growing?
No, not that you're growing,
Oh,
but
okay, yeah.
there are plenty of native plants, especially some of the conifers that don't
Yes.
sprout until there's been a fire. And
Absolutely. Jack pine, for sure. I was just caught off guard because I thought we were growing some herbaceous species that I'll have to burn at some point. And so yeah, we're walking through that project, and we're going to be part of the success of the project is the idea of really connecting with neighborhood stewards who we've just got the category of block ambassadors, and essentially they're the folks who we try to give as many resources and education to so that they can become the sort of experts and leads for different kinds of projects within their own areas. And so last year we did a whole certification training program with the ambassadors, and this year the plan is to do a couple more workshops just like that to kind of give them more identification and monitoring training, so that that's something that we can start building in. That's a piece of Project Swallowtail that we weren't really able to get off the ground last year, but really want to get people engaged in the citizen science aspect. Like, so, you know, what you've kind of started doing with the Bees in the Burbs page, where folks post and share what they find in their gardens, because that's really crucial. So yeah, that's sort of the multiple streams of things that are kind of going through Project Swallowtail, but it really is taking on a bit of a life of its own now too. So a lot of fusion gardens coming up, and community gardens and things sprouting into spots. So it's cool. It's growing. I'm concerned about how many emails are forthcoming to my mailbox, but yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited for how it goes.
so one of the things I wanted to just throw in as something we've learned here in Toronto is the value of collaboration between groups. There are a lot of positive feelings towards helping native bees, native plants, but when we went into this, there wasn't a kind of a central clearinghouse. There wasn't a way for all the different groups that might want to help out do it, and Project Swallowtail became that. Now, in Australia, I think I've seen a connection happening this evening on the chat and online, and I would think that you know, Diane and Kit and probably the many others who would like to do this in Australia should just try and pull all the different groups together and have them keep talking to Project Swallowtail. We can share experiences. It's really, it improves your spirit when you hear what other people are trying and hear about their successes and a little bit about their failures. I mean, we've tried things that didn't work too.
Yeah, I have no doubt that like I can learn so much from what you're doing as you know, a template for what is possible here in Australia. So yeah, I'm keen to sort of pick your brains about what works and what doesn't, because yeah, like with my research as well, some things have not worked, but that's a learning experience, and that's also, yeah, also valuable to know.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk anytime. It is really quite cool because, as I mentioned, Clement sits on the steering committee of Project Swallowtail, but so do 11 other people, and they're all from different organizations. Some of them don't belong to organizations and are just like, you know, volunteering their time. And everyone, I never really know what everybody's working on at any given time, but whenever we come to meetings, there's always so much happening. And that's kind of what the strength of Project Swallowtail is, that this ability to reach out within organizations where there isn't like any, there aren't any like finances on the line, you know. I'm just able to reach out to you know, a steering committee member who happens to work at World Wildlife Fund and be like, hey, can you talk about or like promote this talk in your next newsletter? And just little things like that are really that strength that comes through this loose collective working towards a, you know, one goal.
Let's get back. Is anybody else who would like to ask a question of Kit, of Junaid, of Diane? Diane, where are you in Southeast Queensland?
That's where Diane was. Diane is
Or
now in
what?
Toronto.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I mean, she might be back there again, but as far as I know.
No, I'm in Toronto. I'm in a
Yeah,
total
okay.
flag. So, because I was very involved, the other thing that's interesting that we spent a lot of time on was community weeding, because native plants are extremely important in Australia. They are like, they are crowded out by the imported plants that are brought in. There's not only a sort of pollinator issue, but there's also kind of how it fits into the ecosystem. And so a lot of groups do weeding, especially we did it on the dunes. But we also, because we realized that we needed to have seeds, we started our own community nursery. And that was, an interesting experience. And it's grown now to self-sufficient. It's a not-for-profit business. So when I moved to Toronto in the middle of the pandemic, I had no way of finding, kindred spirits, except for Project Swallowtail, which I just happened to find out about because Pete Ewens, who's very involved in it, lived beside my real estate agent. Anyhow.
All right. We are running towards the end of our time, and I would like to take a moment as an unpaid political announcement to mention something about the Ukraine. And many of us involved in Project Swallowtail, involved in the Horticultural Society, other things like that, are people with broad interests. And most of us can't help but feel for what's happening in Ukraine and all over Europe and the rest of the world where the Ukrainian refugees have gone. The band whose website is at the top there was one of about 10 or 12 bands that got together to do a benefit here in Toronto for Ukrainian charities. They have a link, but the thing that they have at the bottom, in times like this that are a bit chaotic, it's good to know where you can send money and have it be used properly. Because, there's obviously scammers and others trying to take advantage of this as well. So this Linktree Ukraine resources link contains a list of places that have been checked out by people in the Ukrainian relief community here in Toronto. They know that they're good. And so if you want to help, you can go there. While I was struggling with Zoom, I have the latest Mac, and Zoom on the latest Mac behaves very strangely. I lost my direct link into what the Karinya band was doing, but they sing a song that is popular in Ukraine. It's a song of, Eastern European dark mourning type sounds. And I asked them for the translation. The Tiznya is a little winding river in Ukraine. The duckling floats on Tiznya. Mother, don't be upset with me. You are upset at me in a dark hour. I don't know where I'll die. I'll die on foreign lands. Who will dig my grave? Strangers will prepare my body. Won't you feel grief, mother? How could I grieve, my son, when as a child you lay over my heart? Well, that speaks so much to conditions right now. And of course, when you hear it sung in the Ukrainian, it sounds very interesting. So urge you all, if you feel like helping out with Ukrainian refugees, Ukrainian medical supplies, and so on, follow that link at the bottom. Thank you for giving me that minute or two to tell you about that. All right. Junaid, Ron, anybody have anything final to say?
I would just say,
Thank you.
sorry. There was two emails. Like, is that the link Ukraine resources or the one in the top, Corinne?
The one on the top was one of the bands that was at that concert. And I will paste the YouTube address for the whole benefit concert into the chat in one moment.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you once again, Kit, for speaking to us today. And I don't know how early it is in Australia, but or where you are in Australia specifically, but Clement said it was very early. So thank you for that. And thanks everyone from the Parkdale and Toronto Horticultural Societies. This was real cool. And yeah, thanks, Clement. I will share the recording of this with you by tomorrow.
And I will put in a plug that Project Swallowtail has done excellently on recording video work for the internet. And on their website, there are a number of different talks. Pete Ewens did a fantastic job. Junaid's not too bad himself in the woods.
No, he's pretty good. Could I say one thing, Clement?
Mhm.
Jeanette mentioned something about finances for Project Swallowtail, and I meant to donate to Project Swallowtail. Maybe you could do a little plug for yourself.
Me do a plug for me?
No.
Project Swallowtail.
Clement had a thing for the finances to contribute to if you wanted to. Am I imagining this?
That I put up something about Ukraine. Junaid.
No, but before that, a month ago, you had talked about contributing to Project Swallowtail.
Junaid, maybe.
Oh, were those donation links that didn't
Yes.
work and then did work and then didn't work? Ah, okay, yes, okay. So if there was a link shared about being able to donate to Project Swallowtail, apologies for, yes, somewhere around a month ago when it would have gone around, it seemed like there was an entire back-end breach across the internet for many different websites, and our website manager essentially allowed nobody to access our page until we were able to verify a whole bunch of security things, which took us a few days to do because nobody knew this was happening. It happened over a weekend. Everything's fine now. So I can share the information once again with you all if you're interested. But yeah, apologies for that a month ago.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, with that, I guess I would like to thank Kit Prendergast for speaking, and Junaid and Project Swallowtail for hosting, and of course, the Horticultural Societies of Parkdale and Toronto. Have a great time and enjoy the season wherever you are.